Hi YouTube and Blade Forums, John here. Today I'm here to compare the Kershaw Leek and the ZT450. The big headline of this video is that the $40 knife outperformed the $160 knife in a cut test. The Kershaw Leek cut 560 pieces of 3/8 inch sisal rope. The ZT450 cut 440 pieces, which is still a respectable number. But it did in fact lose to a knife that is 1/4 of the cost. So in this video I intend to go over how the $40 knife outcut the $160 knife, and also why it costs $40 to make this knife and $160 to make this knife. Okay? So first of all, for cutting performance, that comes down to a couple measures. First, you have your steel selection on the blade. Second, you have your edge geometry. Now, for me personally, I would argue that edge geometry plays as much of a role in cutting performance as does the steel choice, if not more of a role. Okay? So, looking at these two knives, first you'll notice the edge geometry. You'll notice the thickness of the blade steel on both of these knives. Here is the Kershaw, and here is the ZT. Okay, there's a significant difference in edge thickness here, maybe 30 to 50% thicker on the ZT. Okay? Now, a knife can still have a thick blade and still cut well if it has good geometry. So just because it has a thick blade stock doesn't mean it won't cut well necessarily. Okay? But what's important and what's critical with cutting performance with the geometry is how thin the edge is. Okay? So what angle the edge is cut at, and then how thin the metal is right behind the edge, and then also how gradually the edge gets thicker from the bottom to the top. So basically, when it starts thin and gets thick to the top, it's a question of how fast does it get thick as you go up. So the slower that it gets thick, the better cutting performance it's going to have. Okay? So when it gradually tapers to a thick point at the top, it's going to cut better than if it suddenly tapers to the top really quickly. Okay? I don't know if you'll be able to see it in this video, but when I turn these knives over, let me try to get some light on here. Alright, you can see the thickness of the blade. The ZT is very thick behind the edge. Okay? And it gets really thick really fast too. Okay? This one right here, it's really thin behind the edge, but it actually gets a little bit thinner too because it's a hollow grind. Okay? So this is kind of carved out here, so it gives you a nice thin section. So by having the thinner knife stock and by having it gradually taper to the top, what you have is a knife that's going to cut through material with less pressure. Okay? And that's huge. That's huge for cutting performance. It also makes a difference on how long the edge will stay sharp, and it also makes a difference on user fatigue. The thicker the blade is, the harder it is to cut through the material, the more tired you're going to get from making the cuts. So therefore, the less cuts you can make. Okay? Now as far as steels go, a lot of people refer to the Sandvik 14C28N as a cheap steel or a low-end steel, and they refer to the Kershaw Leek as a budget knife or a cheap knife or a low-end knife. They refer to S35VN as one of the best all-around steels, a premium steel, a high-end steel, and the ZT a high-end knife, a premium knife. Okay? While I agree that this is a high-end premium knife and it has a very nice blade steel, this by no means is a cheap knife. It is not a cheap knife, it is not a low-end knife. This is a high-quality knife that is sold at a very good price. It's a high-value knife. It's made in USA still even. Okay? Now, the reason for such a big price difference on here is not that this is just a better knife. The reason that these have such a large cost difference is because of the amount of time it takes to manufacture each item. The Kershaw Leek can be manufactured quicker than the ZT450. Okay? On your blade here, the Sandvik steel can actually be stamped out by a big press. So they can stamp out tons of these on every production run. Okay? So imagine, and then this one right here has to be cut out by a laser. So you have to have a laser cut out the shape out of a big sheet of steel. So imagine if you're making cookies, okay, like gingerbread cookies, and you have a little stamp, a cookie cutter, in the shape of a gingerbread man, and you push down on the dough, you immediately have your gingerbread man cookie. Okay? That's how this knife is made. That's how the blade is made on this knife. Now take the ZT. Imagine you're taking that same sheet of cookie dough and you're making the gingerbread man, but instead of using the cookie cutter, you use a knife or a blade or a pin or something, and you cut out the cookie dough guy with your hand. Okay, that process is going to take a lot longer. Okay, so that accounts for a big difference in the price. Okay, so when you're able to, you can probably stamp out, you can stamp out several times more of these knives for every one of these knife blades here. Okay, so that's a huge part of the cost. Okay, the Sandvik steel is a premium steel for its category. It's a very fine and tight grain, and it's produced very consistently, and it can be heat treated to a very high level. Okay, now this steel here, this one actually does cost a little bit more to make, but it's not because the steel is more expensive itself per se. They're both carbon and iron mostly. Okay, but this is more expensive because there's more production involved. There's more human labor involved and more steps in making this steel over this steel. Okay, so just because it takes more steps to manufacture it doesn't mean that it's a better knife or a better steel. Okay, but because of those extra steps, it enables them to get characteristics out of steel that they weren't able to get before the powder technology existed. Okay, furthermore on this knife, the difference in blade steels, maybe this blade would cost, in actual materials, maybe this blade would cost, $2 or $3, whereas this one in actual materials might cost $5 to $10. Okay, but really the extra cost is from cutting out the blade versus stamping the blade. Now as far as the handles go, this is a soft stainless steel handle, so this handle was also stamped out. Okay, so they stamp out all these pieces and then they bolt them together. So it's just two pieces of stamped steel. Very simple. This is titanium. Titanium is a much harder metal. This also has to be cut out with a laser. So what you end up with is something that still took more time to manufacture. There was more steps involved, there was more human labor. Therefore, the cost for this handle is more. So when you add up the cost for the more expensive handle and the more expensive knife blade, you end up with a knife that's 4 times the price of this knife. So again, that doesn't mean it's a better knife. It just means that it costs more to produce. It means that there were more steps involved, and some of the materials cost a little bit more money. But on a small knife, the material costs are almost negligible. The main cost comes from production. Okay. So here you have a very similar knife to the Kershaw Leek. This is the Spyderco Delica in stainless steel. These knives are basically identical. They both have a stainless steel blade and they have a stainless steel handle. This knife in a retail store costs $60, this one costs $95. The majority of the price difference just comes from the fact that this blade has to be cut out and this one can be stamped. Okay? This knife here outperformed both Delicas and the ZT. The only knife that it didn't outperform was the Spyderco Sage 3. The Sage 3 comes in S30V. Okay? And this thing has excellent edge geometry. The edge is just about as thin as the edges on the Leek here. And this one though, it tapers up more gradually to the full thickness of the spine here than the Leek does. And therefore that makes this a better slicer. So now not only do you have a slicer that's a little bit better than this, but you also have a premium, a higher wear resistant stainless steel here. And because of that, you get the edge geometry combined with the higher abrasion resistant steel, you get twice the cutting performance. 560 cuts versus 1050 cuts. Okay? So, that's a basic explanation of why your Leek costs less money than your other type of knives. It's not that it's a cheaper knife, it's just there is less manufacturing involved to make this knife. They are able to make this knife more efficiently than they can make this knife. In other words, it takes less time to make this knife, and they don't have to pay as much labor to make each one of these as they do to make each one of these. So, overall, just because a knife has better cutting performance doesn't mean it's a better knife overall. It depends on what your use for the knife is. The ZT, having a thicker blade stock and being thicker behind the edge, makes it a better hard use knife. This knife can be subjected to more impacts and it can hold up. Where this one, with any strong impact or bending, it could break, and that's because the blade is so thin. This Leek here is really made for cutting. The ZT is meant for anything that can happen. Where someone needs a sturdy pocket knife, where they know they can beat it and it will survive. So, Those are the big differences between those two. And my advice to anyone would be not to discredit this one just because it's cheaper. And also not to automatically assume that the more expensive knife is better. So it depends on what you're looking for in a knife. Okay, so with all that said, I think when you're going out to buy your knife, you need to really first and foremost consider what you're going to use it for. For me personally, for everyday carry, for me, which is, cutting an apple, cutting a thread, cutting open an envelope, maybe an Amazon box from time to time, I like a knife that can get very, very sharp and hold that very, very sharp edge. And that's exactly what a steel like the Sandvik does very well on this Kershaw Leek. So for me, this is what I like. The steel has very good edge stability. Edge stability is how keen of an edge a knife can hold without it deforming or rolling or chipping. So the Kershaw with the Sandvik steel takes a very fine edge and has very good edge stability. And for my kind of cutting performance, where I just want it to be as sharp as it possibly can and stay that way for a while, this for me is the ideal kind of knife. I really do wish I could have this knife blade with this steel on my Benchmade 940-1 because I just like to keep my steels razor sharp. Now, on the other hand, if you are military or law enforcement, or you do a job where you depend on your knife, or the knife could potentially, you'll be in a situation where the knife could save your life, then a good quality CPM steel, a powder steel, is what you may want. Even though this doesn't get as fine of an edge in most cases as a Sandvik steel here, like this, it doesn't get as fine of an edge, but what it does is it holds a very usable and very workable edge for a lot longer time. So even though this got more cuts on my cutting test before it would stop cutting paper, this one would actually continue on farther past that point. Even though it wouldn't cut paper anymore, this knife will hold that usable edge well beyond the point for which this one would continue going. So if you're, like I said, in military, or if you're on a boat, fisherman, and you get caught in a rope or a net and it's going to come down to saving your life, you're going to want to know that your steel is going to have a usable edge. And that's one thing that's good about these powder steels, is you can sharpen them once and you can forget about them for a long time. They might not have the keenest, sharpest, razor-like edge, but they will have an edge that's going to perform. Not only that, because these steels have a lot of carbides in them, those little fine little pieces of alloy metal in there that are all throughout here sporadically, it makes it kind of almost like a saw. So these powder steels cut very aggressively. So if you had to cut, rope, like I said, to save your life, this is going to cut through the rope faster than this one. This being a really smooth blade. This one also feels smooth, but it actually has that really nice aggressive cutting edge. So when it comes to cutting that rope, this is going to do the better job. So also, if you're military and law enforcement, or you do a lot of hard use in your everyday carry, this thing here has a much thicker edge. There's a lot more metal behind the edge here. So that means that this knife can be used a lot harder. You can thrust with it, you can hit things with it, and the edge is not going to bend or break because there is just so much steel supporting it right behind the edge. So that's why these ET knives are often classified as a hard use blade. And I would not want to recommend this to someone for law enforcement or military, not at all. Not even for a sailor, or a fisherman, just because even though it holds a very fine edge, if you're going to be like on a mission for many months at a time and you're not able to sharpen your knife, even though this got beat in the cutting test, this one is going to hold a usable edge for a lot longer than this would. And that's why for hard use, military, law enforcement, sailor type knives, I would recommend something with the powder metal steel. So that's my video, and thank you guys very much for watching. Bye.